Okay, let's unpack something pretty intense today.
Yeah.
The book we're looking at makes this really provocative argument.
Mm-hmm.
He says the recent global crisis, it's not just another event, it's genuinely unparalleled in modern history.
Wow.
Yeah, a defining moment that could change things forever,
Mhm.
potentially pushing us into, well, the toughest times in generations. The authors are saying it wasn't just a health crisis.
Right. They see it more as a catalyst.
Exactly. Something that exposed these deep cracks in society and might actually be kicking off a whole new kind of world.
And that's really the heart of the book we're exploring. COVID-19, the Great Reset, published right in the middle of everything.
Yeah.
And its whole point is to analyze these profound, maybe permanent changes the pandemic set in motion, what they call the Great Reset.
So our mission here is basically to navigate the book's thinking, try to pull out the key ideas, the surprising angles they offer on how things might get reshaped.
Looking at how all the risks link up, the incredible speed of it all.
Right, and how these resets could ripple through everything, global systems, economies, down to businesses, and even, well, us, our individual lives.
And the book starts by painting a really stark picture of the crisis itself, calls it a moment with no parallel in modern history.
And not parallel.
Yeah, causing economic disruption of monumental proportions, creating, as they put it, a dangerous and volatile period, politically, socially, geopolitically, just everywhere.
But they also put it in historical context, which I found fascinating. They remind us, pandemics themselves, not new at all.
Absolutely not. They point back to things like the plague of Justinian, the Black Death back in the 14th century, big historical markers.
And what's really striking is how the book shows past epidemics weren't just about health. They triggered radical changes in society, like the Black Death potentially helping end feudalism.
Exactly. And things we all got used to recently, like quarantines, centuries old. The word quarantine even comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. The 40 days ships had to wait in Venice during the plague, an early public health measure that actually helped build state power.
It really makes you think. These responses are so deep-rooted. But the book also highlights a darker pattern from history.
Scapegoating.
Yeah. That tendency during epidemics to blame outsiders, marginalized groups, a really disturbing echo from the past, like the persecution during the Black Death that we still see playing out.
It's a sobering reminder. So while a pandemic isn't new, the book argues the nature of the shock is different. They don't see it as a black swan event.
Not a black swan, like totally unpredictable.
Right. Not like the 2008 crash maybe felt to some. They call this a white swan.
A white swan? Okay, what's the difference?
They mean it was anticipated. Experts, the WHO, people like Bill Gates, they'd been warning about a major pandemic risk for years. It wasn't if, it was when.
Ah, okay. So the event wasn't a shock, but the impact certainly was. And the book identifies what three key features of this white swan shock?
Yes. Three crucial things they really focus on. First, interdependence. How deeply connected everything is now.
Right.
An infectious disease doesn't stay in the health box. The book shows its direct links to, say, governance failures, social unrest, unemployment, fiscal crises. It all ties together.
So no more thinking in silos.
Exactly. They say that kind of thinking is just invalid now. You can't understand or fix one part alone.
Makes sense. What's the second characteristic?
Velocity, the sheer speed of it all. How fast the virus spread, how quickly society had to change. We live in a real-time society, as they put it.
You saw that with cases doubling in just days in some places early on. Italy, New York.
Staggering speed. And it made decision-making incredibly hard, amplified the shock. They even used that Hemingway line, things happen gradually, then suddenly.
Yeah, like systems hitting a tipping point.
Precisely. Shifts build up, then bam, it feels instant. And the third factor is complexity.
Complex.
They see the pandemic not as a simple linear problem, but as a complex adaptive system. Health, economy, behavior, policy, all interacting, constantly shifting, influencing each other in unpredictable ways.
So, hard to control or predict outcomes.
Extremely difficult. And these three things together, interdependence, velocity, complexity, are why the authors think this crisis could be so transformative, more so than recent crises.
Wow, okay. That framework itself is really useful. So let's use it to look at what the book calls the macro resets, these big system-level changes they anticipate, starting with the economic reset.
And they don't pull any punches here. They describe the economic collapse as abrupt and brutal, unprecedented speed, faster than the Great Depression hitting, faster than 2008.
Yeah, unprecedented feels right. I mean, the scale of job losses, so sudden. The book uses the U.S. example, 36 million jobs gone in just 2 months early on. Wiped out a decade of gains.
It's mind-boggling, and the book raises a real worry. Many temporary layoffs might become permanent, especially as companies double down on automation.
Which leads to that automation anxiety they talk about, and potentially more polarization in the job market.
Exactly. Routine jobs, especially lower-wage ones, become much more vulnerable when firms look to cut costs or reduce human interaction.
And this ties into a bigger point the book makes about how we even measure economic success, right? Moving beyond GDP.
Yes, that's crucial. GDP has been the standard, but it completely misses things like natural capital, social capital, the value of unpaid work like caregiving. Doesn't capture any of that.
So what do they suggest instead?
A broader dashboard, looking at how gains are distributed, wealth inequality, resilience. They point to New Zealand's well-being budget from 2019 as a real-world example of trying to prioritize more than just raw growth figures.
That's a fundamental challenge to how we think about progress. Now, the book isn't all doom and gloom on jobs, is it?
No, definitely not. They actually see potential for significant new job creation, particularly in what they call the social economy.
A social economy? Like what?
Caregiving, personal services, education, health. They cite estimates suggesting big investments there. Childcare, elder care could create millions of jobs in major economies, a potentially high-growth, job-rich area for the future.
Okay, interesting. Shifting gears a bit, what about the response from governments and central banks? The book describes the fiscal and monetary policies as, well, massive and fast.
Absolutely. Central banks everywhere cut rates, launched enormous quantitative easing, basically flooding the system with money. Governments rolled out huge spending packages, aid, income support, stimulus.
Which led to huge deficits, soaring debt, especially in wealthier nations. And the book notes the impact is really different for rich versus emerging economies, right? Many just couldn't afford that scale of response.
Vastly different. A key point the authors make is that the crisis basically tore down the artificial barrier between fiscal policy, government spending, and monetary policy, central banks.
How so?
With interest rates already near zero, central banks had limited ammo, so governments and central banks had to coordinate like never before. This brought ideas once on the fringe, like modern monetary theory or even helicopter money,
Direct payments to people.
into more mainstream discussion, at least temporarily.
And this feeds into the big debate. What happens next with prices? Inflation or deflation?
The book lays out both sides. You have structural trends pushing prices down, aging populations, technology making things cheaper, but then you have all this stimulus potentially pushing prices up.
So where do they land?
It's nuanced. They suggest high-income countries might face something like Japanification, low growth, low inflation, super low interest rates for a long time.
Which sounds kind of grim.
Well, they make the point that Japan's experience isn't necessarily a disaster. High living standards are still possible in that environment, especially when you factor in demographics. It's not automatic doom.
Okay, let's pivot from economics to the societal reset. The book argues this crisis really puts societies to the test and predicts a lot of anger at governments seen as failing.
Definitely. And crucially, they push back hard against the idea the pandemic was a great leveler. They call it the great unequalizer.
The great unequalizer. Why?
Because it massively amplified inequalities that were already there. Income, wealth, opportunity. The gaps just got wider.
Can you give an example from the book?
Sure. Think about the difference between, say, a finance professional easily working from home versus a low-paid worker in a grocery store or meatpacking plant. Essential, yes, but facing huge health risks just to keep earning.
Right. Very different realities.
The book even mentions that film Sorry We Missed You to show the precarious situation of gig workers like delivery drivers even before the pandemic hit. The crisis just pushed many over the edge.
And this worsening inequality, combined with existing grievances, fueled the risk of social unrest. The book uses the George Floyd protests as a key example here.
They argue Floyd's death was the spark, but the tinder was already there, fanned by the pandemic. Systemic racial inequalities laid bare like Black Americans suffering much higher COVID death rates, plus the massive sudden unemployment hitting minority communities hardest.
So the pandemic exposed and amplified the underlying issues.
Exactly. They mention this sociological idea, biographical availability. Basically, if you're unemployed, you might have more time and motivation to join protests. The movement quickly grew beyond police brutality to demands for broader economic justice. It shows how these risks intertwine.
It really connects the dots. Another big societal shift of the book points to is the return of big government.
Yeah, historically, big crises like wars always boost state power. Think higher taxes to fund war efforts.
Right.
The book gives examples, top tax rates soaring in the US and UK during the World Wars. They argue the pandemic made government important again, in a way we haven't seen for decades. It shifted perceptions, tipping the balance back towards the public sphere after years of focusing on shrinking the state.
And I think this shift is lasting.
They suggest the idea that government should actively shape markets, not just fix failures, is gaining ground. The scale of the response showed government's power and necessity.
Which probably means higher taxes eventually.
They anticipate that, yes. Especially for the wealthy, to fund things like better public health, more resilience. This also connects to strengthening social safety nets and that move towards stakeholder capitalism.
Where companies focus on more than just shareholder profits.
Exactly, considering employees, customers, the environment, the community, a broader sense of corporate responsibility.
Which naturally leads to this idea of redefining social contracts. The book calls this a huge task for our time, an epical task.
It's fundamental. They use sick leave as an example. Compare the U.S., where it's often patchy, especially for low-wage workers, with Europe or Japan, where it's usually mandatory. The crisis really highlighted how vulnerable many essential workers were without that basic protection.
A harsh spotlight indeed.
And the book stresses we need to listen to the younger generation in this. Gen Z, coming of age amid recession, climate fears. They see a broken path ahead and have, as the book puts it, a deep desire for radical change.
Okay, from society to the world stage.
Yeah.
The geopolitical reset. The book sees the pandemic exposing and speeding up a crisis of global governments.
Yeah, trends that were already there, less multilateralism, more nationalism, a sort of global order deficit got supercharged, countries turned inward. The book even suggests the shock makes extreme scenarios like states collapsing or major power conflicts feel a bit more plausible now.
And one big trend is deglobalization or regionalization.
Right. The book is realistic the complex global economy won't just disappear, but globalization can slow down, maybe partly reverse. Tighter borders, protectionism, less trust in far-flung supply chains. The pandemic reinforced all that.
Makes sense.
They bring up Donnie Roderick's globalization trilemma, this idea you can't easily have deep globalization, democracy, and strong nation-states all at once. The pandemic definitely strengthened the nation-state focus, putting pressure on the other two.
So more focus on regional blocks, like the EU, North America.
That seems like a likely outcome, yeah. Accelerating trends already making trade more regional, and huge pressure to reshore supply chains, bring production home for key goods, even if it costs more.
Like the example they give about U.S. reliance on China for antibiotics.
Exactly. A real wake-up call about vulnerabilities in critical sectors.
Okay, let's touch on the environmental reset. The book notes emissions dropped during lockdowns, but not nearly enough, right?
Right. That 8% drop in 2020 was temporary and insufficient for climate goals. But they see a potential silver lining, a risk awakening.
Meaning?
The pandemic made us all acutely aware of a huge, sudden global risk and the need for urgent action. The hope is that awareness might transfer to climate change, another existential risk that often feels more distant.
So, maybe more political will, tying stimulus to green goals.
That's the argument. Plus, maybe the experience of cleaner air during lockdowns gives people a tangible sense of what could be gained. A collective realization, perhaps.
Finally, the technological reset. The book sees the pandemic as a massive accelerator here. Digital transformation on fast forward.
Absolutely. Remote everything, they call it. Years of tech adoption crammed into months. E-commerce exploded, contactless went mainstream, digital entertainment soared, automation sped up.
Telemedicine is a huge example. Remote working for so many. Online banking, too.
Huge shifts. And it wasn't just office work. The book talks about automation and AI accelerating in physical spaces, too. Warehouses, supermarkets, hospitals. Using robots to reduce human contact, fill labor gaps. Delivery robots became more visible.
A real push to turbocharge automation.
Definitely, especially in areas like autonomous delivery, remote health. But this comes with major concerns about surveillance technology.
Ah, the tracking and tracing.
Exactly. The book details the widespread use, explaining the difference between tracking your location in real time, GPS, versus tracing who you've been near retrospectively, Bluetooth.
And the privacy implications are enormous.
Huge. The book contrasts the more intrusive approaches in some places with the more privacy-focused efforts in others, like Europe. They quote officials trying to avoid a false dilemma between health and privacy. And they flag the risk of companies using tech to monitor employee health.
Which leads to this risk of dystopia idea, surveillance capitalism.
Yeah, the worry that all this data collection tracking our digital lives, our movements, could be used to monitor and manipulate us. Privacy advocates fear pandemic tech could become permanent, a watershed in the history of surveillance.
A chilling thought.
And there's the related concern about technological solutionism, relying on tech fixes while ignoring the root causes of problems like inequality or climate change.
Okay, that covers the big macro resets. Let's briefly touch on the micro resets' impacts on industries, businesses, and individuals.
Well, for businesses, it echoes the macro themes. Need for agility, flexibility, rethinking supply chains for resilience, not just cost, and really integrating ESG, environmental, social governance into strategy. It's a reset for how businesses define value, too.
And then the individual reset. The book gets quite philosophical here about what the crisis forces us to confront about being human.
Yeah, the moral choices. Self-preservation versus the collective good. It notes the amazing compassion we saw healthcare workers, volunteers, but also that historical tendency towards selfishness, scapegoating during epidemics, referencing writers like Orhan Pamuk on blaming outsiders in times of fear.
And the toll on mental health and well-being was immense.
Huge. More anxiety, existing conditions worsening, and tragically, the rise in domestic violence linked to the stress, uncertainty, and confinement of lockdowns. The book cites some stark UN projections on that.
But amidst the hardship, the book also finds potential for changing priorities, even unexpected creativity.
Right. Those historical stories are amazing. Isaac Newton during the London Plague years, making breakthroughs in calculus, optics, gravity. Wow.
Or Shakespeare writing King Lear, Macbeth during plague closures, Pushkin having a super creative burst during a cholera quarantine. It shows this incredible human resilience, finding potential even in awful circumstances.
Maybe being forced to slow down unlocked something. The book also talks about reevaluating consumption.
Yeah, looking at alternatives like Japanification and culture minimalism, finding purpose, ikigai, connecting with nature, forest bathing, or the Nordic approach, less focus on showing off wealth. Models for finding fulfillment beyond just buying stuff. Better for us, better for the planet.
And finally, fairness at the individual level. It loops back to that great unequalizer point.
Exactly. Using the George Floyd example again, it stresses that people react emotionally based on narratives of fairness, not just stats. As things generally improve, expectations for fairness rise too. So perceived unfairness now feels even sharper.
Okay, so connecting all these threads, the book's main message seems to be that the pandemic wasn't just an event to get through. No, it was a catalyst. It exposed and sped up trends and weaknesses that were already there across every level, macro, micro, individual. And it's all interconnected. Change one thing, it affects others.
But that interconnectedness also implies possibility, right?
Right.
The book seems to suggest crises can lead to real transformation.
Absolutely. It points to positive potentials. A renewed focus on the common good. Stakeholder capitalism taking hold, greater awareness of risks, maybe finally tackling huge issues like inequality and climate change more seriously.
It does sound like there's a cause for hope woven in there, especially near the end.
There is. The book mentions thinkers like Jared Diamond and Amartya Sen, suggesting that getting through the pandemic could motivate us to deal with those bigger existential threats we've ignored. Diamond hopes it could be a silver lining, or a great cause for hope if it prepares us for what's next.
That potential for transformation really sticks with you. The book says, a new world will emerge, the contours of which are for us to both imagine and to draw.
That sums it up perfectly. The future isn't set in stone.
All right, so looking at COVID-19, the Great Reset, it's clear the pandemic is way more than something to just recover from. It's a force driving change everywhere. Exposed weaknesses, yes, but also highlighted huge opportunities for fundamental shifts.
From measuring economies differently to finding personal purpose.
But it also leaves us knowing the exact shape of things is still uncertain. Nothing's guaranteed. The outcomes depend on choices being made now, by governments, businesses, all of us.
It definitely makes you stop and think critically about the changes unfolding all around us.
Absolutely. And, thinking deeply, engaging with complex ideas like these, that's something we're really passionate about. Did you know on our YouTube channel, mindful moments.
Ah, yes.
We actually use AI to help analyze books on important topics, aiming to spark exactly that kind of reflection and critical thinking.
It's a fantastic resource if you want to dive even deeper into challenging subjects in a really thought-provoking way. We'll put a link in the description for this conversation.
Definitely check it out. And of course, you can find this discussion and others exploring fascinating topics right here on our podcast.
We really hope this conversation gave you some valuable food for thought as you navigate this changing world.
Yeah, it's true. Like the authors say, the outlines of this new world are ours to imagine and draw. So maybe the question is, what role will you play in shaping the future we build from this reset? Keep thinking critically about the changes you see.
And if you found this discussion useful, please subscribe to our podcasts so you don't miss future ones. Maybe share it with someone else who's curious about where things are heading.
And if you want the full picture from the authors themselves, consider grabbing a copy of the book. The purchase link is in the description too.
Until next time, keep thinking.